Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Source Diversity Tracking Workshop. This is a free event hosted by the National Association of Science Writers. I'm Cassandra Williard, Vice President of NASW and a freelance science journalist. I'll be moderating today's discussion, which was co-organized by myself and fellow board member Jyoti Madhusudanan. Part of the reason we wanted to put this workshop together is that diversity in our stories matters. It impacts the stories that get told, how they get told, and the voices that get heard. Tracking source diversity isn't a magic bullet, but it's a way to keep ourselves accountable. This session is going to happen in two parts. From 1 p.m. Eastern to 2:15 Eastern, we're going to be in this webinar space. And then after this session, we'll take a short break and reconvene via a second different Zoom link at 2:30 Eastern. The second link is included in the same confirmation email at the bottom. If you're not able to find it, please drop a note in the chat and we'll help you out. We will be taking questions. Please use the Q&A function at any time to send your question in. If you do not wish your name to be mentioned, please file anonymously. The session is being recorded and will be accessible to NASW members for viewing. You may take screenshots of the speakers, but you may not take screenshots of other participants. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. We were supposed to have Rob Samuels here and he had to cancel very last minute, so I do apologize about that. Siri Carpenter is co-founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit journalism organization, The Open Notebook, and editor of the book, The Craft of Science Writing. She has a PhD in psychology from Yale University and is a past president of the National Association of Science Writers. Melba Newsome is an award-winning journalist with over 20 years of experience, contributing features to some of the country's most widely read publications. During her 2020 Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellowship, she created a diversity training program to help newsrooms better reflect the communities they serve by including more people of color and underrepresented groups in their reporting. Melba lives in Charlotte, North Carolina. Hannah Haynes is a newscaster and producer at Wisconsin Public Radio. She heads WPR's Source Demographic Project, which involves surveying sources to gather basic demographic information. She's also the source librarian for the news department, where she works with reporters to find sources who are underrepresented in WPR coverage. Jyoti Madhusudanan is a freelance science writer based in Portland, Oregon. She covers life sciences research, bioethics, and health for Nature, Science, The Guardian, and other outlets. And she also tracks her own source diversity. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Siri so she can kick us off.
Hello, hi everyone. Thanks so much, Cassie and Jyoti Tinsley, for hosting this. I'm so thrilled that the National Association of Science Writers has taken on this project to create this workshop, and I'm really thrilled to be here with these esteemed panelists. I excuse me, wanted to kick things off this afternoon by just very briefly, first of all, saying that telling you who I am. I'm as Cassie said, I'm the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Open Notebook, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to help science journalists improve their skills. And at the Open Notebook, we have published a lot of resource pages and articles that relate in one way or another to diversity, equity, and inclusion in science journalism. And that includes a set of resources around source diversity and source tracking, some of which were published just last week. I want to just take a minute or two to talk about this kind of the underlying question here. Why are we talking about source diversity tracking? And as we wrote in an earlier resource page at the Open Notebook, we're doing that because we care about this because the lack of diversity in science journalism is a problem. It limits what stories get told, whose voices are heard, how the stories are told, and it affects public perceptions of the scientific enterprise. And it casts questions on who science is for. It perpetuates stereotypes and social injustices and so on. So there are many, many reasons why we care about the diversity of our sources. And the reason that we care about tracking the diversity of our sources is that, first of all, oftentimes we think that we may be doing a better job than we really are at including diverse voices in our stories. This is, as someone who's a social psychologist by training, I think that this is kind of baked into the way that our minds work, that we have this, excuse me, we have the belief that we're doing better than we may be doing. And so collecting data is a really good idea. And of course, it is also extremely consistent with the goals of science journalism in the first place. The perspective that I am bringing to this workshop with respect to tracking source diversity comes from having done a bunch of research over the last couple of years on different approaches to tracking source diversity. And I know that this is something that Melba is also going to talk about more, having done a really big research project on this. We at the Open Notebook were doing this research for two purposes, both for the purpose of creating a source tracking system for ourselves to use at TON, and to create a public facing resource that would, we hoped would be helpful to the science journalism community. Some of you might have seen the guide to tracking source diversity that we published at TON last week, along with a sample script and sample survey for collecting demographic data from sources. We created that guide. It came, as I say, it came out of wanting to track our own sources and understand whether we were being as inclusive as we would wish to be. We had questions about the best practices for doing that. What data should we collect? How should we collect it? What should we do with it? What minefields did we need to watch out for? And so we approached that as a research project to try to find out the answers, both for ourselves at the Open Notebook, and then to create a public-facing guide. In the process of doing that, we talked with a lot of reporters and editors who were either tracking their sources or wanted to, but had lots of questions. And that told us that a lot of the questions that we had about the best ways to do this are questions that other people shared. Excuse my cough. We, really our goal was to create a system that would be both ethical and practical. And so a little over a year ago, I happened to have a conversation with Sarah Shipley-Hiles, who is a professor of journalism at the Missouri School of Journalism. And she was interested in these same questions and thinking about them from the perspective of her students and how to help students do source tracking. And so we decided to team up and work on creating this guide together. And we hired two of Sarah's brilliant students, Rashida Ghosh and Fariona McGee, to help us report out the project and speak with journalists and editors about their processes and their insights in doing source tracking. We also very closely studied published case studies from newsrooms and individuals who were tracking source diversity, including the Wisconsin Public Radio system that Hannah Haynes is going to talk about a little bit later, and a number of others. And then in parallel with that, we were working on developing our own system. And there's nothing like trying to actually set up a system that really alerts you to the myriad little technical questions that you might run into in doing that. So it was very helpful to be working on setting up our own system as we were thinking about what should go into a guide for tracking sources. And I want to just give a brief shout out to Carolyn Wilkie, who did an enormous amount of work helping to develop that system that we're using at the Open Notebook, and pilot tested it last fall. We got our system underway just at the very end of 2021. So we're pretty new at doing this, but the data are accruing fast. One of the really key lessons from this whole process that I've taken away is that there is no perfect system for tracking source diversity. There are many, many good practices that you have to think about what is the best practice for you as an individual journalist or you as a newsroom, but there is no perfect system. But also that any thoughtful and intentional effort to better understand who is being included in your stories is better than doing nothing at all. I wanted to focus on two specific aspects of the tracking process that we talk about in this guide that we recently published. Excuse me. One of those is kind of centers on dealing with discomfort that a lot of reporters might feel in talking about identity with their sources and in collecting data. I think it's not at all uncommon for reporters to feel, for people to feel uncomfortable asking their sources about aspects of identity like race or ethnicity or gender identity, and they might feel like doing so feels like an invasion of privacy. And I think that's a completely natural and empathetic thing to feel. I also want to make the argument that us feeling uncomfortable as reporters is not a good enough reason not to do it. And that's the underlying concept that that went into trying to create this guide, that whether we're feeling comfortable with it or not, it is something that we should very strongly consider doing, and that there are people who have come before us who have learned how to do it well, and we can learn from them. One of the, our own experience in beginning to track source diversity at TON, and based on what we've learned from other journalists and newsrooms that have extensive experience in doing it, what we have learned is that seldom are sources offended or made uncomfortable by source tracking efforts. I've heard almost no reports of a source feeling offended by that. And so I think that a lot of that discomfort comes from us and not from our sources. And so that, I think, can be a source of comfort, that it might feel something that feels awkward or uncomfortable at first as you're getting used to doing it, but it's not something that is resulting in a whole, group of people being, offended out there. The key thing, I think, is that it's really crucial to be transparent about your reasons for collecting data when you're talking with sources, to let them know what the purpose is in doing it, that providing responses is completely optional, and that their individual data will be kept confidential. I wanted to talk a little bit about one particular question that comes up in tracking source diversity, which is, do I really have to ask people about their race? Do I really have to ask people about their gender identity? Couldn't I just look on Twitter and see what I can find in people's bios, or look on LinkedIn or people's websites or whatever, and infer information about people's identities from what I can find online or from my personal knowledge of these people or whatever? I think it can be really tempting to avoid the entire topic of how to talk to people about their personal identities by just not doing so, and instead to make those inferences. And I do not recommend this, what I call guessing and Googling method of tracking source diversity, for a couple of reasons. The first is that I would argue that it is likely to result in inaccurate data, because any assumptions that we are making about people's identities, such as their race or their gender identity or other aspects of identity that we might be tracking, are just likely to sometimes be wrong. And the second is that in some cases, collecting and storing demographic information without people's knowledge could be a violation of certain privacy laws that require that any information that you're collecting or storing in a database about aspects of about demographics, the person has to have given explicit permission for that. So that's two reasons why I quite strongly advise against the guessing and Googling method of collecting data. The other aspect of the whole source tracking thing that I wanted to shine a little bit of light on is a question that often comes up of, if you're thinking about tracking source diversity, you might be feeling like, but what about tokenism? I really do not want to be tokenizing people, and this feels like it could be tokenism, and is it a bad idea to do it in the first place? And my feeling about tokenism is it's absolutely something to be avoided, and also that it's something that can be avoided, and it can be avoided, fairly simply. If you're thinking in terms of quotas or fulfilling requirements for diversity, then you, I think, are more likely to fall victim to tokenizing, that you might find yourself thinking, I need to include at least one person of color in this story, or I need to include at least one woman physicist or something. And that is a way of approaching it that I don't think feels good to any of us, and it wouldn't feel good to our sources if they knew that they were being approached so that we could tick off a diversity box somewhere. Rather, I think what we need to do is just to approach this process in a more intentional way, looking for people who have relevant expertise or experience or perspective, or who advance our stories in some way. And in a sort of a mental shortcut that you can use in thinking about that is, would I want to include this person in my story if diversity weren't part of the reason that I were including them? If it were just a question of whether the perspectives or experience that they're bringing is relevant to my story. And if the answer is yes, then that's great. So I'm going to end here and pass things over to Hannah, and we'll chat more in the Q&A.
Actually, Siri, I'm going to hand it off to Melba for just a quick second in case she has anything to add, and then we'll move on.
All right.
Thank you, Cassandra. Yes, I will just speak briefly about my project, my fellowship project with the Reynolds Journalism Institute, because it kind of goes with what Siri was saying, how she came to put this project together for the Open Notebook. That was my proposal, and to talk about how to make our reporting more reflective of the communities that we report on, and the newsrooms, where the newsrooms are. Is your reporting reflecting the people in your service area? And I proposed this before the pandemic and before all of the the summer of the protests, the racial justice protests and everything. And I was chosen for that class, like when all of that stuff was going on, but it really turned out to be very timely and topical, because there was a lot of interest in covering people of color, getting them more involved in the stories. That all just kind of came together. And my timing was great. I've been asked to talk about this a lot from what I learned. And I just wanted to say that as a woman of color, what Siri was saying about, do we feel that we are, stepping on somebody's toes if they ask us to identify with race? And personally, and what I hear from a lot of other, Black people, people think, they say, well, I don't see color, so they think there's something wrong with seeing color. Well, there is nothing wrong with seeing color. The wrong part comes in when we attach a certain value to that race or whatever. So I am not offended if somebody asks me if, am I Black? I'm more offended when they say, well, I didn't know because I don't pay attention, because first of all, that's not true. We are in a society that is so racist, the third rail. Race is it's so tied into everything in this society. So you cannot overlook it. And I just don't believe people when they say they don't see it. And that's not a good thing either, because it kind of erases so much about a person's identity when you don't acknowledge that or see that, or just bypass it. And so what I learned a lot from the project, and one thing that I'll just quote a couple of stats, because I did this project in concert with 3 newsrooms here in North Carolina: the Charlotte Observer, WFAE Public Radio, and North Carolina Health News. And so all of their reporters took the survey and that I put together. And what I found was that race and ethnicity is considered the most important factor in determining diversity. And then more than 90% of the reporters who responded say they either make diversity a top priority or try to include it when it seems natural. And the biggest obstacle to getting more diverse sources is not having a ready list, so that if you're on deadline, your time is tight, you just go with the people you've already gone. And 85% said they believe diversity is very important, but only 13% routinely ask for an expert of color. So that gave me a good insight into what we were dealing with, and it also a lot of positive. It let me know that journalists think this is important. So at least we didn't have to start with building the wheel and trying to convince them of why. But that is something that I will talk about later, where to find people and what you need to do to prepare and to cultivate those sources. So thank you. And Cassandra.
Yeah, thanks so much, Melba and Siri. We're going to go over to Hannah next.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Haynes, and I work at Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process. Talked a lot about why this matters and ways of thinking about it. At WPR, we've been doing this work for over 3 years now. And I'll just dive right in. So when we started the project, we had 3 goals. One, as Siri touched on, no educated guessing on the demographics of our sources. Siri did an excellent job of explaining why that can be problematic. So it was really important to us that we were going to be asking sources themselves, getting their demographic information from them, and getting that consent as well to have that demographic information. The second goal was to minimize additional workload for reporters and producers. We're a pretty small newsroom at Wisconsin Public Radio, and we cover the entire state. So our reporters, just like a lot of newsrooms, they're spread very thin. They have a lot of work that they're doing every day, and it was important to us to try to do a project like this, but add as small of additional workload to their plates as possible. And I'll talk about how we ended up doing that. And then the third goal was accountability and improvement. So from the very beginning, we wanted to share the information that we were gathering, the data, with our audience and show them how we were doing. And also, we knew from the beginning we were going to need to make plans to improve, because even if we had absolutely incredible demographic data that really surprised us, which we didn't, we knew that we should always be working to do better. So those were the 3 goals. Ultimately, we decided to send a survey to sources, and we decided to have reporters and producers provide the first name, last name, and email address of their sources. And then I, as the project lead, would go in and gather that data on a weekly basis and send a survey to every source that we had on air. The way we did that was we had a system built into our CMS. So when a reporter or a producer was going to file a story for our website, that's where they would enter the source information. And then our website would gather all of those names and the emails into basically an Excel sheet. And I would use Qualtrics, was the survey system that we use, to send out those emails. So we've always had about a 50% response rate. It's never dropped below 45%, and it consistently is hovering around 50%. We were very pleased with that, and we found that the method that we've been using to be very effective. I think a fear that we had early on was that we would have a very low response rate and we wouldn't have enough data to really be meaningful and to work with. But with a 50% response rate, we have a lot to work with. I also worked with the Survey Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to just ask them some questions about best practices on how to do a survey, and a few things that I found. They recommended to keep your survey very short. And so even though you probably want to ask 20 questions, keep it as short as you possibly can. People are going to be more likely to take it and more likely to finish the survey and submit it if it's very short. The other thing was to be mindful about what time of day and what days you're sending out the email that has the survey link in it. So I'm sure everyone can relate. If you get an email on a Monday morning when you're dealing with a bunch of emails at once, you may be less likely to prioritize a survey that you got from WPR. So things like that. And so I think all of those things helped us have a really good response rate. A couple of lessons that I learned through the process. One is a little more technical, so bear with me. But if you want to build a project like this and you want it to be around for a long time, I think that you need to be thinking about long-term sustainability of a database that you're building. So for us, now we have like 9,000 people that have been entered as sources over 3 years. So it's grown very large. And we've realized, you have to assign a unique identifier to every person so you can make sure you're counting people properly. So if we have a source that has appeared 5 times, we don't want to send them the survey 5 times. We want to make sure to send them the survey once and count them. So things like that, be thinking about how to make your database sustainable over the long term. The second lesson is to think about what promise you can make to your sources. So for example, we promise that people's demographic information won't be shared with their name attached. And we only have a couple people in the organization who have access to the database that holds demographic information. And we also have that database protected in our systems to make it less vulnerable to being attacked or stolen. So I would be thinking about stuff like that. Demographics can be very personal depending on what questions you're asking. And the last thing I'll mention before I pass it on is that in 1 year at WPR, we found that 85% of our sources were white. And we had a pretty even gender split between men and women, but we had almost no sources outside of that gender binary. And we had a decent geographical diversity in Wisconsin. But after we implemented some plans to improve, like our source Rolodex, which we can talk more about later, and the source librarian role, we saw that in year 2, 80% of our sources were white, and every other category of race and or ethnicity grew. So that's a 5% decline in white sources. So we definitely counted that as a win. It's not the finish line, and we're still working to improve. But we think that the plans that we put in place to improve did show that we made some significant progress. And we're just continuing on that road now as we head into the 4th year of gathering data. And so with that, I will pass it on. Thank you.
Okay, great. Jyoti, do you want to take over now?
Sure. Hi, I can talk a little bit about how I implemented a source tracking system as a freelancer. It's a little bit like what Hannah said. I had a sense that, as Siri mentioned, we often think we're doing better than we might think than we actually are doing. When I started freelancing, questions of gender representation in science were making the rounds. So I had the sense that it was really important to represent women's voices in my stories. And since I began, I was in the habit of tracking the gender balance in my stories on a sort of case-by-case basis. So every story, I would make sure I had some women's voices in there and so on. And it was pretty easy to do, but the downsides of that were, firstly, it was easy to feel good about myself if I had like 3 stories in a row, which all included women's sources. But I didn't actually know how I was doing over time and across my entire body of work. And the other aspect of it was that I wanted to start tracking other demographics, race, ethnicity, geography, and so on. And it was a lot harder to keep track of that for each individual story. There were too many moving parts. So last year, I put together a really simple Google form that I send to sources when a story publishes. So literally the email that I send them is, thank you for taking the time to talk with me. Here's a link to the story. And when you have a minute, could you please fill this form out for me? And the form essentially asks for their name, email, geographic location, pronouns, gender, race, and ethnicity. And for each of the demographic questions, they have the option to select more than one, as well as there's a write-in option so they can fill in whatever they want. I do recognize that my system's a little biased. I don't track response rates super closely. I know not everyone responds, but I don't know how many do. I check back after a story is published to make sure there's at least a few more responses in there. It does only track the people I've quoted. It doesn't track everyone I've spoken to. That is fine with me because I do want to improve whose voices I'm representing in the stories, not just who I speak with on background. The biggest advantage for me is that the system doesn't take a lot of work. I look at the form every few weeks to see how I'm doing, but beyond that, it's literally just a link in an email I send. How it's helped me is that firstly, there's less mental gymnastics involved with wondering how I'm doing and am I getting this right? When the question comes up, as it does when we're talking now, I have a sense of where I stand somewhat. It's better than guessing. And what I did find was that I was doing pretty well on the gender front, but not so much in terms of geography or race and ethnicity. I was getting diversity when it felt natural, as Melba said. I would include relevant experts in certain stories. So if I was doing a story about racial disparities in precision medicine, I would make sure I was including a Black geneticist, other people of color. But I wasn't doing quite as well on stories about lab techniques or general health stories and that sort of thing, which does form a big chunk of my work as a freelancer. So the tracking just showed me that what I was doing wasn't actually enough. And I've started making an effort now to include sources from different backgrounds in all of my stories. Because my goal with doing this was not just about including diverse voices when I think it matters. It matters to represent their expertise across the board because it does exist. And that to me is really the point of being more inclusive and intentional about source tracking. The one other advantage I would like to emphasize is that it's made my stories richer. I have more bits of narrative that go into the most mundane story because people open up about their personal experience and it's incredibly relevant to these pieces. It's also just led to more story ideas, more profiles, more features, all of that, which is gold to a freelancer.
Great, thanks, Jyoti. Melba, do you want to take over from here?
Sure, thank you again. Well, everybody said a lot, but and a lot of what I wanted to cover. So this has been very comprehensive already so far. And I just want to, at this point, talk about what I learned in my project. You may know, as a reporter, we go into these things often thinking we know everything. And so that was kind of how I went into my fellowship. It's like, oh, I know all this. I'm just going to do the project and then share things with you and everything. But I learned a lot. First off, I thought that a lot of the reasons people of color aren't included in stories is because they're not asked, because the journalists don't ask them. And that is a big part of it. But the other thing is a lot of times there's reluctance or resistance because they feel, as Siri mentioned about being tokenized. Oh, you're just looking to check that box of getting a Black person here, or you're just coming to me to talk about this because you need somebody. This is a subject that you don't pay attention to any other time. So I had to find a way around that. And even as a person of color, it was still a challenge for me. And an example was I wrote a feature about, we were getting ready to redo the history books in North Carolina. And the history books here, they're not as bad as they used to be, but they were pretty much written by the Daughters of the Confederacy, which I grew up in the South, and we did not call it the Civil War. We called it the war between the states, which kind of indicates that there were two equal, warring nations, except, not a nation that seceded and committed treason and all that. So that's how the history books were written. And that's what I grew up learning. But that's changed since then. And so they were making more changes. And I wanted to get someone who had grown up here and talk about the school books and the history books and the way they're written here. And I found a Black history professor who was born and raised in North Carolina, went to public schools, got her degrees from Chapel Hill and Duke, I think. But anyway, in history, to talk about this. And she's like, I'm not sure I'm qualified. And I'm going, well, if you're not qualified, who is qualified? You know, not only understand this from a perspective as an academic, but as someone who knows what these history books were like. And she pointed me to two guys who I'd already interviewed, and I've interviewed before, two prominent historians here, but they were both white men. And I was like, if I wanted to talk to white men, I don't need you to do that. But that was kind of the concern. One of the things that I ran into, and I ran into a couple of times, is that people who haven't been asked are reluctant when they are asked sometimes because they feel the burden of tokenism. So you have to kind of get over that hump with them. And so that comes from why we need to cultivate sources other than when we're just like in a pinch and need to get them. Because if I'm on deadline, and I think most of us write for stories that we can take a month or so to do. But if you're in a daily paper and you have to get a story out, you don't have time to go digging. You'll just kind of go back to who you know. So that's why I think, and if you call up somebody that you've had no contact with and try to get them at the last minute, you may not have a lot of success. So that's what I mean about talking to people, developing, if you're covering a beat, kind of establishing relationships with those people aside from when you are ready to, when you desperately need them as a source, and explaining your work. So that's very important to do that prep work beforehand. Other thing is, don't just parachute into a community. And this is something that happens all of the time. Communities of color are often reported on when there's a crisis, but not so much when just to cover the garden festival or something in the community. I would say the Black community here in West Charlotte. And that's how you establish relationships, so people don't think you're just there. You build trust, and they don't think you're just coming in to report on a crisis, because that's not all there is to certain communities is a crisis. One of the things that is important, I think, is to explain the process. When people aren't used to being, when they aren't media savvy, when you're trying to get them to that point where they can be a regular resource for you, I think it's important to take time to explain, okay, I'm talking to a lot of people. You may get a huge part in the story. You may get no part. You may get a couple of lines, so that they will know that and won't feel exploited or whatever, how the story turns out. And then maybe they got one line in this story, but there's another story where they would have tons of space. So I think if you explain that to them, we will cultivate those relationships. Then when we're talking about where to, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but I wanted to say that it's not just the number of people of color or something that you have of diversity in your story, it's how they are reported on. Okay. If, Black people should not only be in your story when it's about crime. Latinos shouldn't only be in your story when it's about immigration or something like that. Cover people that show the full, kind of their full lives, of them going to parent teacher meetings, of them, building a house. My project was about sources in general. So of course I write a lot about science, so that's important too. But it's also important to, just in general, to display people more than their crisis. And one thing that I see, and I don't think a lot of people, it dawns on you that if I'm reporting about, say, sickle cell anemia or whatever, just say that's a disease among Black people, and all of the people who are grappling with disease or treatment, of course, they're going to be Black overwhelmingly, but then all of the experts are white. That's a problem, and I think a lot of people don't realize that. There was an episode of 60 Minutes, which was all about how AI, facial recognition messes up with people of color, and how it's gotten the wrong people arrested because, you know, like they say, we all look alike. And that was what happened. And they had this whole segment about what happens when the people who design the software don't look anything like the general population. And they showed people getting arrested for things that they didn't do because they were misidentified. And all of the people who were victims of this were Black, but all of the experts that they had on were white. And there were definitely Black experts available. In fact, a woman, a scientist from MIT, was kind of developed this whole thing, was the first person to bring it to the fore, and they interviewed her, we later learned, for 9 hours and completely left her out of the story. So those are the kinds of things where I think we have to be more cognizant, is not just counting the numbers, but counting how we portray them. So I just think that if we go through and are very deliberate and practice looking for sources before we need them. And then also a way to find good scientific sources is looking at HBCUs. There are research institutions there. That's a good place. And I will share the booklet I did, like 10 steps to more inclusive reporting, and anybody can see that if they'd like. But I'll just stop right there and be available for Q&A.
Thanks so much, Melba. Just based on what you were talking about, I have a question just to kick us off. I'm curious whether, Jyoti or Hannah, whether you guys track how your sources were represented. The thing that Melba was talking about, like, were they represented as experts or were they represented as, normal citizens, man on the street kind of thing?
Sure, I can jump in on that. At WPR, we do gather that information. So when the reporters or producers are entering in their source information, they're also telling us what the source type was within the context of that story. So were they an expert? Were they an academic, an athlete, things like that? We use community voice to track, man on the street kind of people, or just if you're talking to someone within the community, we track how many children, people under the age of 18 that we're speaking with. Maybe it's a parent that we talk to for a story on schooling or things like that. So we do track all of that, and we're able to cross-reference it with the demographic information that we get. And that can be really helpful, especially if you're thinking about the control that you have. So for example, in Wisconsin, if we're talking about people who are elected into office, overwhelmingly white men. We don't have as much control on those sources when we put them on air, but where we do have controllers, those experts, those academics, those community voices, that's where we can really try to make a difference. So it's really nice to be able to break down that data. And I would recommend anyone doing a project like this, think about tracking the source type.
I'll just add very briefly that my form does include a question for people to describe their specialty or their expertise. The vast majority of my sources are scientists, so it does help that they're all experts. But in the stories that do have a layperson's voice, I do try to factor that into the story itself, but that's more on a story by story basis.
Siri, maybe you want to weigh in on this. Obviously when we think about diversity, you could think of any number of metrics that you could track and different kinds of diversity. So how do we figure out what matters and what we should be tracking? Like what's sort of like the minimum?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, of course, like if you had unlimited resources of time and patience on the part of your sources and your reporters, you could you could probably pick out 20 dimensions of diversity to track on every single story, race and ethnicity and age and geographic location and sexuality and gender identity, and are you and disability and military veteran status, and on and on and on. But it's really not practical to do that. And so I think what is probably wise is for organizations to start out with a manageable number of dimensions of diversity that they're tracking. I would say 3 or 4 or 5, probably not more to start. And I think what those should be for any given media outlet or an individual sort of depends on your circumstances. I think it's most common for people to track race/ethnicity as one category of response options, or race and ethnicity, and then gender identity, and sometimes a couple of other dimensions of diversity. At the Open Notebook, currently what we're doing is tracking race and ethnicity, gender identity, disability, geographic location, and I feel like I'm forgetting something suddenly, but like 4 or 5 things. And the reason that we chose those is, first of all, because we already have vast data about the exclusion, historical and ongoing exclusion of women and non-binary people and people of color from journalism stories across the spectrum, not just in science stories, and but also in science stories. And so we wanted to certainly gather data on those dimensions. We're particularly interested in the Open Notebook in growing our representation of sources from outside the US, and in particularly from the global South or low and middle income countries. And so we track geographic location as a way of being able to see how, if and how we are improving in that respect. And then disability, we ask whether people, the other thing LGBTQ status is the other one that I was forgetting. So we've chosen those. They're sort of I would say, like, probably the most common and most obvious choices, but there could certainly be publications that would decide they don't even need to track gender in their case, or they really want to focus on including more people who are military veterans, or they want to track inclusion of people who come from different religious belief systems or whatever, and so have a different focus. I think the key is probably to start with something that's manageable enough that you are going to be able to effectively gather the data and do it in a thoughtful way. And also that you can really analyze the data, because there are issues of numbers, and if you're trying to do any kind of statistical analyses, you can run into that.
Okay, and here's a question from the audience. When tracking diversity of your sources, what is your goal? To achieve a representation that looks like the scientific workforce or your audience? These two groups might not look the same. And then I'll just open that up to all the panelists.
I just want to say that my goal is to make my reporting better. And I do believe that is important. It rounds out kind of a story. If we have more voices, more people, it just seems more real to me, and deeper and richer if I'm just not like quoting the same old people all the time. And then sometimes I'll get a perspective that I didn't even think of. And that's kind of the most sometimes surprise. If it surprises me as the reporter, I think it's surprising and more interesting to the reader. And as a person of color, for me, it's also about representation, because representation matters. And if we are only, I think it is very important to me for people of color to be seen in every sphere of life. And that's what drives me to try to do that. But I do want to say that I have to check myself sometimes. I'll look up and I'm going, oh, everybody in my story is white, so I got to go back. And that's as a personal code. So that's why I think the tracking is so critical, because we may think we are doing more than we are as far as diversity is concerned. You look back and you're like, oh, 90% of everybody in my story was the same. And I think we need to be on top of that.
If I can jump in, I want to echo everything that Melba says. I think that's exactly right. And I really feel like there are many different ways to think about goals. And I think that setting goals, it has to be an iterative process. So if you're starting out, you might not even know what is the representation of, X dimension of identity in your audience. Or in the community that you are reporting on, especially if you're a freelancer, you might not really have access to that information. I think it is a perfectly legitimate goal to start out with just the goal of doing better than you did before. And then the next goal is to do better than you did before, and to grow in that way. I also think that it becomes easier to set those goals over time as you gather data. And so it might be that you have at the beginning, you have kind of a vague goal of finding out how you're doing and, probably doing better, starting from the assumption that you could be doing better. And then, in 6 months or a year or 2 years down the line, you feel better equipped to say, okay, we have some numbers here now about how we're doing. How does that compare to what we think is the proportions of people within our audience or within the community that we're reporting on. And then one of the things that we talk about in this guide to source tracking that we just published is that the diversity of the community that is your audience may not be the same as the diversity of the community of people who are the subjects of your stories. So if you're talking about the scientific workforce, for example, then it might be the case that only some small percent, 20% of people in the scientific workforce belong to a certain marginalized community, but 40% of people in the general population do. And so then thinking about, do you want to set goals that are around that existing workforce, or do you want to set goals that are around your audience or somewhere in between or something different? I think it has to be a thoughtful and iterative process, and just doing better is a totally legitimate goal. And it shouldn't, not having a more specific goal than that, I don't think should stop anyone from beginning this process.
Okay, great. Here's another question from the audience. What is the benefit in worrying about aspects of diversity that don't end up coming through to readers? For example, LGBTQ, like you're not going to write that someone is that identity in the story.
I can start. Oh, go ahead, Melba.
No, I was just I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Cassandra, could you please repeat?
Yeah, so the question is about, should you worry about aspects of the story that don't, or aspects of diversity that don't come through in the final story? For example, LGBTQ. But I guess maybe there isn't any aspect of that would come through in the story. So maybe it's sort of a moot point, because I'm trying to think whether there's aspects of diversity that we would track that then would be something that we would talk about in the story.
I mean, I do think part of it is what we've already answered when Melba was speaking about the importance of diversity, and ultimately you're trying to make your stories better. And we know that our stories are better when we have a variety of voices, different perspectives, different experiences. And so it doesn't really matter if you know that someone's gay, they're bringing a different perspective and experience to the table. It's not relevant for you to know that piece of information, but it's relevant on the back end that we're trying to get as many voices in our stories as possible.
I will add 2 points to that. One is, It comes up even with questions of race. And I've had stories where I included a Black scientist, and my editors would want to put in that the person was Black, and I would push to remove that because I was like, it doesn't matter in this context. Sometimes it does, because when they're speaking about their experience, I've also had sources talking about their research and then saying, well, and as a Black woman, I've had this experience myself and my family, so on. And if I'm including that aspect of it, then it is important so it does get represented in the story. The other piece of it I will mention is that I asked a scientist this question once, the founder of 500 Queer Scientists, to be precise. And the response was that it does matter to, even if we're not mentioning these aspects of diversity in the printed story, the very fact that that person's name is out there, it normalizes the existence of this identity and makes it more acceptable to see that person as part of the scientific community, which matters just as much as whether or not we're actually actively discussing their social status.
Great, thank you guys. Okay, how do you avoid parachute journalism when you are working on a specific topic or beat, especially in a science context? In my beat, I often end up going into different communities and I try to form relationships, but often I can't sell more than one story on that topic, or it's for a book from many different geographic areas. Yeah, I think parachute journalism has been given a bad name, and I think sometimes it's unavoidable. So how do you make it as least parachutey as possible?
Something that's helped me is to be introduced by someone. And even though I may not have talked to, quote, this particular community, if I know someone who is a part of that, and I often do say, can you introduce me to, I'm doing a big story on like communities that are, prone to flooding because of climate change and, what's happening with and of course, these are mostly poor communities of color on the coast. And so knowing someone there and asking them to introduce me to someone, they can kind of vouch for me that maybe this is the first time I've done this story, but she's legit and she covers these type of issues, and that's probably, I think, the best you're going to get if you're not been in that place before. But I think that helps if you have the credibility that you can kind of attach yourself to.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, here's another question from the audience. Doesn't who we consider as marginalized groups depend on geography too, and thus our classification of our diversity? So how do we handle that if we do journalism in many different geographies? Any insights?
I would love to talk about that a little bit. That's a really great question. I think absolutely geographic diversity is an important aspect of diversity and something that a lot of people in newsrooms probably do want to keep track of. And we do so at the Open Notebook. One of the things that's tricky in collecting demographic source data is that thinking about what are the questions that you're going to ask and what are the response options that you're going to provide so that you can minimize the chances that someone is going to have to click other, and that you are being as inclusive as possible in your actual surveying and not othering people is really important and really difficult. If you only include US Census options for race and ethnicity, then you will have more difficulty in capturing the range of diversity that you will have in your sources around the world. At the same time, if you provide 150 possible response options for people, you'll still miss some. So I think it's really tricky, and probably from me, my experience has been it's the trickiest question to ask in terms of what you provide as response options. And the solution that we have come up with, at least provisionally and pending, we're doing a 3-year historical source audit right now. And I think after we have that much larger number of people, we'll have a better sense of whether our system is good enough or should be tweaked. Is we provide a bunch of response categories that people can include, and we try to make that as inclusive as possible, knowing that it is inherently flawed. For example, Asian or Asian American, like that is a huge range of people. Like that is a really broad group of way to categorize human beings. And there are many people around the world would identify as according to some much more specific identity. We also, but we do include that. But what we also do is have an open-ended response area, so people can they could click, for example, Asian, but then also fill in something that in a self-reported open-ended way, or they could only respond in an open-ended way. They could respond to multiple categories. None of these are perfect solutions. And as I've said, there just is no, I really believe there is no perfect solution. I'd be super interested to hear from you, Hannah, what you guys do at WPR. I remember looking at your report, but now I can't remember specifically what you do. But I think it's really hard to have that to capture that geographic diversity in a single question. We try to do it by a combination of the race, ethnicity questions and the actual geographic location questions.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right that there's no perfect system. When I was developing our survey, I did consult with some experts on how to give people the best options we can. And just like you said, one of the best practices is to give people an open field where they can type in whatever they want. The answers you're providing might not be sufficient for someone. And so you should absolutely be giving people the opportunity to fill in that box. And I mean, at WPR, we're really looking for statewide representation. So we ask for zip code, and that's how we're gathering the geographical information. But definitely with race and ethnicity, I think be really mindful when you're building your survey to give people the most options possible. In Wisconsin, we have a very large Native American population. So we actually ask a question like, can you tell us if you're a part of a tribe? Would you like to tell us what tribe you're affiliated with? So things like that, it can depend, it can vary based on where you are and the type of people that you're talking to, but you want to try to capture as much as you can.
Hannah, here's a quick question for you. And this is something I wanted you to talk about anyway. Hannah, now that you have such a large database, have your reporters been able to use it proactively to find sources for stories? Or is that tricky and impossible because of the way the database is restricted to a few people in the newsroom?
Yeah, so like I said, we try to be really mindful of keeping people's demographic information as private as we can. And so we don't allow everyone in the newsroom to access that database that has the demographic information attached. But instead, what we do is we created a source Rolodex for our newsroom, where it has about 300 sources at this point, and is constantly being built upon. But like Melba was saying, something that people have a lot of trouble with is if they're on a deadline, they're constantly going back to the same source over and over again. So this was our attempt to kind of solve that problem basically as best as we could. And so the Rolodex has first name, last name, contact information. It has a brief description of what the person does, where they work, and then it has a field of kind of keywords. So you could go into it and you can search for a key term based on a story that you're doing, and hopefully you can find a source on that topic. And we've been building it over time to make it as varied as possible, to give people a lot of options on a lot of different topics. And the idea is everyone in the Rolodex is currently underrepresented in WPR's demographic data. And so that's kind of the base that we're working with. And reporters have told me they find this really helpful, especially when they're on a hard deadline. Most of our newsroom is working on daily stories that they're turning very quickly. So having a resource like this, I think, has really helped. And we implemented that in year 2 of the project, and we did see a huge improvement. So I think part of the reason that we improved was because of that Rolodex.
Great, thank you. Could any of the panelists talk about experiences surveying sources in non-US countries? Social mores about what's appropriate to ask a stranger might differ from place to place, and a journalist might not be aware of this for everywhere in the world. Who wants to take this one? Siri or Jyoti, is this have either of you run into this?
Yes, that is something that we have encountered and questioned ourselves at the Open Notebook, because we do interview people from all over the world. We're only about 5 or 6 months into our process of collecting source data. So, our numbers are limited at this point. I think we have around 100 sources represented in our tracking database so far. So far, it has not proved to be a problem. We've interviewed, and so this includes people we've interviewed in various countries in Latin America, probably about 5 or 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent, Nepal, China, and elsewhere in the world. And we have a very high response rate overall. We have about a 90% response rate to our survey, and I don't believe that we have any lower response rate among people who are from other parts of the world. It's an open question whether that trend will hold up over time. We haven't heard anybody objecting to being asked, or in the open-ended part of the survey where we basically say anything else you want to say. There, we haven't heard anyone expressing that they are uncomfortable. We don't have really anyone saying prefer not to answer on practically anything. So I've been actually pleasantly surprised by how open people have been. The big caveat is that our sources are journalists. The Open Notebook's audience is journalists, and our sources are journalists for the most part. And so that might not be true among other audiences, other publications with other communities of sources.
Yeah, just speaking about the scientists, I don't think I've had anyone, the geography has not been an issue with, they don't understand the questions, or they don't want to answer, or haven't noticed a significant difference. So most of my sources are scientists, but it's never been a question of, I don't want to do this, or I don't understand this.
I'll also just say that I think making every question optional is important. So maybe someone wants to tell you their race and or ethnicity, but they're not comfortable telling you their gender identity. We ask a question, are you transgender? Maybe they're not comfortable answering that. And so every question we make optional, and you can skip it and still submit the survey.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll have to wrap up and take a break. This, I feel like, is a really tricky one. I often find myself covering very small fields of science with only a handful of people doing it, often not a very diverse group. The sessions made me realize I've been guilty of tokenism in a lot of these stories, because the publication really wants diverse sources, but then I'm just asking people who aren't really part of the story for comment. Any ideas how I can avoid this? Is it worse to have an all-male white cast, or to include a token quote from someone else?
Maybe I can kick things off by saying, first of all, yeah, there are some fields of science where it is just flat out a bigger challenge to include a diverse range of sources along certain dimensions than others. That's certainly, it's a lot harder to find women in certain fields of physics than it is to find women in, practically any field of biology, probably. It seems like the issue that the person asking this excellent question might be running into is that it can be really hard to do this stuff on deadline. So if you're doing a story and you have to scramble around to try to find sources who are relevant and have the right expertise and are available, and your deadline is in a couple of hours, then you might easily find yourself taking some shortcuts that you wouldn't otherwise take if you had had more time to kind of intentionally approach it. And so I think that part of the answer to that question is that it is a long-term and continuous process. It's not a problem that you can easily solve on deadline in one story, but rather that you can take time to intentionally build and diversify your network of sources in the fields that you cover, so that then when the right story comes along, a story comes along and you're looking for the right sources, you have somewhere to turn that you've already given thought to, instead of feeling like you're just including someone because you want a Black source or you want an LGBTQ source or whatever. But it's a kind of a never-ending iterative process of diversifying your networks and getting to know the work that people in that field do who you might not have otherwise heard of. It's something that you can, every time you're interviewing sources, you can ask them about who else is doing good work in their field, who's might be under-recognized, or who you can, it's okay to use the word race. You can, are there people of color who are doing excellent work in their field who you might not be aware of, and just be building up this kind of personal database of potential future sources, even if you don't know exactly when or how you're going to use those sources. Melba, as a freelancer, I'm kind of curious how you go about that, because you're doing stories on a whole range of topics for a whole range of different publications, and I'm sure that this is a question that you have run into often.
About how to, not just have somebody in there, try to get the right person. It's a lot about asking people who they know, and a lot of that is other writers too, because if there are few writers, we're in the science, write about science and health, and I ask them, do you know anybody who does this? And a lot of times I'll just put out a call, to my friends who cover this kind of stuff, and ask them for references, and then I'll use them kind of to get connected with someone, and asking other people in the field, like a few experts that I've talked to. I go back to them and say, I interviewed an ecohydrologist, and I said, okay, which first of all, I had to figure out what that was. And then I needed someone to talk about biodiversity. And I asked him, and he had a great source. And I often find that people are very, kind of tapped in and know a lot more if you ask, and are willing to help too.
Great, thanks. I want to wrap this up, but just one last question before we take a break. How can public information officers at organizations help journalists be more diverse in the sources they use?
I answered that question in the chat, and I was saying, first of all, have more people in your list of who you put out for spokespeople. I call a public information officer at a research institution or university, and I ask for somebody about this, and 9 times out of 10, they will give me a white male. And I'll go back to them and I'm like, I want someone of color. I want a woman, or, and then they usually will come back to me with someone like that. But I think you have to ask, because they have their list of the same people that they put out for spokespeople. And I think the public information officers, the PR people, they need to have a diverse list too, so that they're not always just sending out, giving you the same sources.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That for a public information officer, the task of diversifying your network is almost identical to the task for journalists, with the exception that you're limiting yourself by and large to one institution. But a lot of universities have many different affinity groups for experts in different fields who come from different underrepresented communities. I was talking with Kelly Terrell, she is the research communications director at the University of Wisconsin, and she by night is the social media editor for the Open Notebook. And we were talking about this not long ago, and she was saying that something that they offer at UW-Madison is like weeks long, or I think maybe even semester long, media training opportunities for select experts at the institution, so that they're developing their own internal understanding of who is at this huge institution, and better equipping themselves to be able to point reporters toward those people, and also helping those people feel more comfortable in talking with reporters. So I suppose, like anything, it's just a never-ending process to develop and diversify your list of sources, whether you work for an institution or whether you're a reporter.
Great. Thanks to all the panelists. We are going to take a short break, and we'll come back together at 2:30 Eastern, but you're going to use a different link to come back. And I think Tinsley dropped it in the chat. And also it should be at the bottom of the email where you found the link to come here. So we'll take a 10-minute break, back at 2:30 Eastern, and we'll split up into breakout rooms then. Okay, thanks.